All right, we are working on GDP per capita. That is the gross domestic product. So we're talking about all the goods and services produced by the individuals of a country, all kind of thrown in together. So you can see the GDP in billions of dollars for these countries. So you can see the U.S. Far out produces, I mean, almost double China. China's got way more people than we do. So the GDP is goods and services produced by that particular country. Okay? So we have the GDP in billions, right? And remember that billion means times 10 to the, not 10 to the ninth. And then we have the population in millions. And remember, millions is times 10 to the sixth. So these numbers that we're dealing with, we got to work. So we're going to do Australia together, and I'm going to have you guys do fill out the rest of the table on your own. So gross domestic product per capita. So remember, per, if you remember this from class, per means division bar. So GDP comes first. So we're going to do Australia. The GDP of Australia is 1532 billion. So times 10 to the ninth. And I know that's not scientific notation, but just stay with me for a second. And that's GDP per capita. Capita means people. So we're going to divide that by our population, which is 22.0 times 10 to the sixth. Now, when I do this division, and yes, I know it's not scientific notation, just give me a minute. If I divide these two numbers, I get, here we go, 69.636. That's a decimal point. And then you subtract your exponents because we're dividing, so times 10 to the third power. Well, when you're talking about gross domestic product per capita, we don't want to talk about things in scientific notation. We're talking about money. So I'm going to take that scientific notation, I'm going to change it to standard form. So positive 3, I'm going to take my decimal point. Dang it. I'm going to take my decimal point and I'm going to move it 1, 2, 3 places. So for Australia, the GDP is $69,636. So what that means is that every person, right, because per capita means per person, every person in Australia produces $69,636 worth of goods every year. That's a lot. That's a high GDP per capita, but that's Australia. So I want you, doing this concept, GDP divided by the population, fill out the rest of the table. After you have it done, then go to the, hit pause and finish that. Then come back, and the next screen has all the answers so that you can see if you did it right. And I show the work. So hit pause, try them, and then continue on. So here's the answers, and you can see I labeled the countries, and here's your GDP per capita, right? So, excuse me, all of these are per capita. When you look back at the original table, this column right here gets the overall GDP of the entire country, whereas this column, which is what's on my next page, gives you for each one. Okay? So we are now going to answer questions based off of this data. So, and you might want to go ahead and try to answer these questions first and then come back. So in number one, okay, my time wasn't moving there for a minute. I don't know, it's a dumb thing. Okay, in number one, which country has the highest GDP? Notice it's asking for just the highest GDP overall, right? And so that, if you recall, is the U.S. On that big screen, the original, the U.S. has the overall largest GDP. Who has the lowest gross domestic product? And that would be Madagascar. We'll just call them Madag. So here's, U.S. has the biggest. 9.98 billion is Madagascar. That's very, very small. Now, do those overall GDPs correlate into the highest GDP per capita? Well, when you look through, the country with the highest GDP per capita, if you look at all of these, and don't forget Australia, which was up over 69,000, Australia is definitely the highest. So who has the highest GDP per capita? Australia. And who has the lowest per capita? Well, that's still Madagascar. So they have the lowest overall and the lowest GDP per capita. Okay, so now looking at number 5. China's GDP is more than 4 times the size of Canada's GDP. We're talking about overall. So then why is China's gross domestic product per capita so much less? Okay, so let's think about this. If we look at China, Their GDP, overall GDP, is 8,227 billion. And their population is 1,350 million. Okay, then we talk about Canada. Canada has a GDP of 1,780 billion, so quite a bit smaller than China, but the population of Canada is only 34.9 million. So when you're talking about gross per capita is per person. Well, look at the difference in populations. I mean, it is just ridiculous. We're talking more than 30 times bigger in terms of population. So, of course, China has so many more people to spread this out. That's why their GDP per capita is so much lower, because they have so many more people. If Canada had a shit ton more people, then the GDP for that would be lower too. But if you have a high GDP, which they do, and a somewhat small population, it's going to give you an overall larger gross domestic product per capita. Okay, number 6. So now we're playing the what if game. If China's GDP were proportional to Australia's, what would China's expected GDP be? So now we're taking out China's gross domestic product. We know what it is, but we're saying let's pretend that they were just like Australia and that they achieved and produced things at that rate. So remember that when we're talking about proportions, we like to be, I like to label. So we're talking about China, we're talking about Australia. So my left ratio will be all about China, my right ratio will be all about Australia. And we're talking about gross domestic product and population. Those are the two things that we know. Well, we're trying to say that Australia is going to stay the same. So if Australia keeps their GDP of 1532 billion and they keep their population of 22 million. Okay, so we're saying what would China's GDP be? So what we're trying to find is this, assuming that their population stays the same at 1,350 million. Now, notice I don't have millions or billions anywhere in here because I'm staying consistent. My GDPs are all in billions, my populations are all in millions, so I'm golden. All right, so now when I do my cross multiplication, let me change colors here for effect. I get 22x equals, take those two big numbers, and I get 2,068,200. So recall that this equal sign splits it in half. I divide both sides by 22, and China's GDP would be 94,009 billion. So if you want to draw that out, you'd have to put 9 zeros at the end of that. I mean, that's just ridiculous. China's actual, I'm out of space and I did not give myself room on the next page, but their actual GDP, I'm just going to write that down here, their actual is, if you remember, 8,227 billion. So you're comparing 8,227 to 94,009. Oh, I don't know, maybe a little bit of a difference, right? So you can see that Australia just far outproduces China because this is what China would produce if they were like Australia. And this is why proportions are cool. You can kind of do this thing. And the last question on this page, what about Madagascar, who has a really low GDP? If they were the same as the U.S., what would Madagascar's expected GDP? So we're going to set it up the same way. We got Madagascar, we got the U.S., we got GDP, and we got the population. Okay, so again, recall that they said we're talking about what would Madagascar's GDP be. So that's where our unknown comes in. And then the other three we get from our table. So the population of Madagascar, 21.9. Population of the U.S. goes on the bottom, 314. The GDP of the U.S., 16,244. And again, we cross multiply. So when I do that, 314x equals 355,743.6. Equal sign splits it. Divide both sides by 314. And Madagascar would have a GDP of 1,133. I rounded to the nearest. And that's billion. So, if I round up, their actual was 10 billion. So if they were like the US, they would be over 1,000 billion instead of 10 billion. That is just, I don't even, those numbers are so large, I can't even comprehend how much they really mean. But that's GDP and GDP per capita. So thanks for watching.